The operating theater at 3 a.m. has a specific kind of silence. It hums with the low frequency of anesthesia machines and smells sharply of cold antiseptic. In this suspended reality, Dr. Anna Gerber and I created the protocol. It wasn't written down. It was a silent agreement born in the space between life and death. But protocols are designed to keep things sterile, to keep emotions contained behind masks. Watching the way her eyes tracked me above her mask, I knew we were about to break every rule. Falling for the chief surgeon wasn't just dangerous. It was a surgical error with no chance of revision. I didn't move to London for the weather. I moved because Chicago had become too loud, too full of ghosts, and I needed a place where the rain could wash the pavement clean every morning. I was a surgical technician, good with my hands, better with anticipation. In the States, the OR was a contact sport. Loud demands, music blasting, egos clashing like titans. I arrived at St. Jude's Hospital expecting something vaguely similar, just with different accents. Instead, I found a culture of silence. The British medical system felt like a complex dance where no one touched and everyone apologized for breathing. It was polite, repressive, and utterly baffling to someone who was used to saying exactly what she meant. Then there was Dr. Anna Gerber. Before I ever saw her face, I felt her reputation. The nurses didn't gossip about her. They whispered warnings. They called her the iceberg, a nickname that felt less like a joke and more like a survival tip. She was the chief surgeon, a prodigy in vascular reconstruction, and a woman who had allegedly made a junior resident cry simply by raising an eyebrow. She didn't yell. She didn't throw instruments. She just existed in a state of such intense, freezing competence that everyone else felt like a clumsy child in her orbit. My first week, I treated it as an exaggeration. I was American. We didn't do subtle hierarchies. I figured she was just focused. Then I saw her in the canteen. It was noon, the room bustling with the clatter of trays and low conversation. In the center of the chaos sat Anna. She was an island. She had a table to herself, not because she had claimed it, but because a natural exclusion zone had formed around her. She was reading a medical journal, her posture perfect, a cup of black coffee steaming untouched beside her hand. She looked severe, beautiful in a way that warned you not to touch. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, revealing the sharp, elegant, tense line of her jaw. I should have walked away. I should have sat with the other techs who were laughing about a patient's wild anesthesia ramblings. But I've never been good at self-preservation. I walked up to her table. The air actually felt thinner the closer I got. "Is that the new issue on aortic valve repair?" I asked. My voice came out too loud, too Chicago, cutting through the polite hum of the room. "I heard the study on synthetic grafts is pretty wild." Anna didn't jump. She didn't even blink. She slowly lowered the journal, marking her page with a slender finger, and looked up. Her eyes were gray, the color of the Thames on a bad day, and they were completely devoid of warmth. She looked at my badge, then at my face, then back to her journal. "This is the staff canteen," she said, her voice low, clipped, and impeccably British. "Not a social club. And if you have time to discuss synthetic grafts, I assume your sterilization logs are already completed?" She didn't wait for an answer. She raised the journal again, effectively erasing me from existence. I stood there, cheeks burning, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on my back. It wasn't just a rejection. It was an eviction. I had breached the perimeter, and I had been repelled with lethal efficiency. I told myself I'd stay out of her way. I'd stick to the day shift, keep my head down, and avoid the chief surgeon at all costs. But hospitals have a way of laughing at your plans. 2 days later, the rota manager posted the new schedule. The night shift lead had gone on maternity leave, and they needed a senior tech to cover the 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. rotation for the next 3 months. My name was at the top of the list. And right next to it, listed as the on-call attending for complex trauma, was Dr. A. Gerber. I was going to be locked in a metal box with the iceberg while the rest of London slept. The fear was real, but beneath it, something else was already taking root, a curiosity I couldn't quite kill. I wanted to know if the ice went all the way down, or if it was just a wall protecting something that could actually burn. My first night on the rotation, London decided to welcome me with a downpour that felt personal. It was a relentless, cold, gray curtain that turned the city into a watercolor painting. I watched the water streak against the glass of the scrub room. It was 2 a.m. The hospital held that deceptive stillness that usually arrives right before chaos kicks down the door. Then, chaos did. The pager on my hip vibrated. Trauma 1, thoracic bleed, male, 45. I was moving before the screen even went dark. When I burst into the operating theater, Dr. Anna Gerber was already there. She wasn't rushing. That was the first thing I noticed. While residents scrambled like panicked birds, Anna was an anchor. She stood by the imaging monitors, hands already scrubbed, staring at the scans with a terrifying stillness. "Scrub in," she said without turning around. "We have 5 minutes before he bleeds out." I hit the sinks. The water was scalding, the antimicrobial soap smelling of harsh lemon. I scrubbed with the muscle memory of 1,000 surgeries, but my heart hammered a different rhythm. This was the real test. We stepped into the sterile field. The room was kept cold to prevent bacterial growth, but the heat coming off the team was palpable. Anna took her position. She didn't speak. She commanded the air in the room. "Scalpel." I slapped the handle into her palm firmly. No hesitation. In Chicago, if you didn't hit the surgeon's hand hard enough, they'd tell you to wake up. Anna didn't flinch. She made the incision, a perfect, bloodless line. The surgery was a mess internally. The patient's chest cavity was filling with blood faster than suction could clear it. The junior resident, Miller, was vibrating with anxiety. He was holding the retractor, but his hand was slipping. "Miller," Anna's voice was soft, dangerous. "If you move that retractor 1 more millimeter, you will sever the phrenic nerve." Miller froze. I'm trying, Dr. Gerber." "Don't try. Do." The tension spiked. The rhythm was breaking. I saw Anna's hand twitch, her patience evaporating. She needed a vascular clamp, specifically a Satinsky, to control the bleed. She opened her mouth to demand it. I didn't wait. I reached across the sterile field, bypassing the frozen resident, and snapped the Satinsky clamp into her waiting hand before she could even form the word. The room went silent. For a second, nobody moved. I had just anticipated the chief surgeon's need in a way that bordered on psychic. Anna paused. Her hand closed around the instrument. She didn't look at the patient. She looked up, directly at me. Above the blue paper mask, her eyes were wide. Not with anger, with recognition. It was the look of a predator, realizing another predator had entered the territory. "Good," she said. She turned back to the chest cavity. Suction. The rest of the surgery was a blur of seamless motion. We fell into a cadence that usually takes years to build. I handed her instruments before she asked. She took them without looking. We spoke a language of pressure and release the residents couldn't hear. When it was over, we found ourselves back at the scrub sinks. The atmosphere shifted. Heavier. I was drying my hands, careful not to look at her, waiting for the reprimand. "You trained at Northwestern," she stated. I turned. She was looking at me in the mirror. Her cap was off, revealing slightly messy blonde hair that softened the severity of her face. "Yes, Dr. Gerber." She nodded once. A sharp, precise movement. It shows. Don't let Miller's incompetence make you lazy. She walked out, the door swinging shut behind her. That was it. No thank you. But in the currency of Anna Gerber, that nod was a knighthood. I stood there in the empty scrub room, listening to the hum of the ventilation, and realized something dangerous. The fear everyone had of her wasn't just respect. It was isolation. She was alone at the top of the mountain, and I wanted to climb up there. The routine settled in after that. Night after night, we worked in that high-wire silence, but the air between us wasn't empty anymore. It was thick, heavy, and charged. The protocol didn't have a start date. It wasn't something we scheduled in Outlook or discussed during rounds. It simply evolved, organic and inevitable, born from the universal currency of the night shift: caffeine. The standard hospital coffee tasted like battery acid filtered through a dirty sock. It was an insult to the very concept of wakefulness. I, being a stubborn Chicagoan who refused to function on substandard fuel, brought a thermos of dark roast every night, a brew strong enough to jumpstart a heart without a defibrillator. One night, 3 weeks into the rotation, I found Anna in the break room. It was a small, windowless box that smelled faintly of bleach and stale toast. She was staring at the vending machine with the kind of lethal intensity usually reserved for a complex tumor. She looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from holding people's lives in your hands for 12 hours straight. Her shoulders, usually held with military precision, were slumped just enough to betray her. "It's broken," she said, not turning around. Her voice was low, rough with tiredness. "The machine. It's taken my pound and it refuses to dispense the tea. I believe it's mocking me." "That's a blessing," I said, unscrewing the cap of my thermos. The smell of rich, dark coffee hit the sterile air instantly, earthy and grounding. "That tea tastes like wet cardboard anyway. You want the real stuff?" Anna turned. Her eyes landed on the thermos. She looked suspicious, then desperate. Accepting food or drink from a subordinate seemed to violate some internal code of conduct she'd written for herself. But the smell won. She nodded, once. I poured the coffee into her mug. She took a sip, and, for the first time, I saw the tension leave her jaw. "God," she whispered, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second. "That's aggressive." "It's effective. It's American," she corrected. But she took another sip, savoring it. We sat at the small, wobbly table near the window. Outside, London was doing what it did best: raining. Not a storm, just that relentless gray drizzle that makes the world feel small and enclosed. We sat in silence for a long time. Usually, quiet with a boss is awkward, but with Anna, it felt companionable. The air thickened, charged with a sudden, sharp awareness. "Do you ever miss the sun?" I asked, watching a droplet race down the glass. "Chicago has winters that will kill you, but at least the sky is blue." "The sun is overrated," Anna murmured, wrapping her hands around the mug for warmth. "It demands too much energy. Rain is honest. It doesn't pretend to be cheerful." I looked at her, surprised by the candor. "That is the most British thing I have ever heard." She glanced at me over the rim of the mug, and there it was, a flicker. A tiny, dry smirk that barely curled the corner of her mouth. "I am a product of my environment. Besides, if the sun came out, the NHS would probably declare a state of emergency and cancel all elective surgeries due to unexpected staff happiness." I laughed. It was a loud, startled sound that echoed in the small room. Anna's eyes crinkled at the edges, just slightly. It was a crack in the marble, a glimpse of the woman beneath the surgeon. From that night on, the protocol was set. 3 a.m., break room, my coffee, her silence. We sat opposite each other at that tiny table, our knees inches apart. In the daylight, that proximity would have been professional. In the middle of the night, with the hospital humming around us and the rain sealing us in, it felt intimate. I became hyper-aware of the space between us, the way she held her mug, long fingers, no polish, nails cut short for surgery. The way she smelled like antiseptic and something warmer, like cedar or old paper. One night, the air felt heavier than usual. We were both scrubbed out, exhausted. "Why do you work nights?" I asked softly. "You're the chief. You could work 9 to 5, do consults." Anna looked at her hands. "The day shift is politics. It's noise. At night, it's just the medicine. It's quiet enough to hear yourself think." She paused, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. "And lately, the company is better." My heart hammered against my ribs. The distance between our knees was negligible, a gap so small it felt like a promise. I didn't move away. I let the tension sit there, heavy and sweet. "I prefer the quiet too," I whispered. She didn't look away. Her gaze lingered, mapping the tension on my face. For a moment, I thought she might reach out. I thought she might cross the invisible line of the protocol. But then her pager beeped. The spell broke. The mask slid back into place. But we both knew the truth. The space between us wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The scrub room has always felt like a confessional booth without the priest. A stainless steel purgatory where you wash away the outside world. It is the most unromantic place on earth, and yet it became the center of my universe. We were prepping for a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, AAAA, the kind of vascular catastrophe that surgeons call a humbler. The patient was a grandfather of 5, and his aorta had split like a worn hose. The odds were terrible. The air in the prep room was heavy, pressurized, thick enough to choke on. Anna stood at the sink next to me, scrubbing with a ferocity that bordered on violence. She wasn't just cleaning her hands. She was trying to scour away the doubt. I could feel the vibration of her anxiety radiating off her body like heat waves off asphalt in July. She was usually a statue, cool and impenetrable, but tonight the cracks were showing. Her jaw was locked so tight I could see the muscle feathering beneath the skin. We moved in silence, a synchronized ballet of antimicrobial soap and stiff brushes. The water ran hot, steam curling up to fog the bottom of the mirror. I watched her reflection. Her eyes were dark, focused on something I couldn't see, perhaps calculating blood loss or suture angles. She looked terrifyingly beautiful in that harsh light, stripped of pretense, armed for battle. We turned off the taps with our elbows in unison, water dripping from our fingertips into the steel basins. We backed into the gowning area. Usually a circulating nurse would be there, waiting to catch the sterile gowns, to tie the backs, to facilitate the transition. But the circulator was gone, sprinting to the blood bank for emergency O negative. It was just us. The mood shifted. It stopped being about the surgery and started being about the oxygen in the room, which suddenly seemed insufficient for 2 people. I grabbed a sterile towel, drying my hands with deliberate slowness, watching her. She stood there, arms raised, waiting for a gown that wasn't coming. "Allow me," I said. My voice sounded too loud, too rough. I grabbed her gown from the sterile pack. I held it open, the blue fabric a shield between us. She stepped into it, her movements fluid, sliding her arms into the sleeves. I stepped around behind her. This was a standard maneuver. I had done it 1,000 times for 100 different surgeons. You secure the neck, you tie the waist, you step away. It is mechanical. It is nothing. But standing behind Anna Gerber wasn't nothing. I was close enough to count the stitches in her scrub cap. I was close enough to smell her, that signature mix of harsh soap and the warm, biological scent of her skin. something like salt and clean linen. The back of her neck was exposed, a vulnerable strip of pale skin between the collar of the gown and the edge of her cap. A few stray blonde hairs had escaped, curling against her nape. My hands came up to the ties at her neck. I should have been quick. I should have been efficient. Instead, my fingers fumbled. I told myself it was the fabric, but that was a lie. I was stalling. I wanted to exist in this space, in her gravity, for just a second longer. I pulled the ties together. As I did, my knuckles grazed the skin of her neck. It was a feather-light touch, barely there, but the reaction was immediate. Anna froze. Her entire body went rigid, the breath hitching in her throat with a sharp, audible click. She didn't pull away. She didn't step forward to break the contact. She stayed right there, trapped in the circle of my arms. And then she leaned back. It was a movement of millimeters, imperceptible to anyone else. But I felt it. She leaned into my touch, seeking the heat of my hands against the cold, sterile air of the room. The contact burned. It wasn't professional. It wasn't accidental. It was a question asked and answered in the language of skin. "Your hands," she whispered. Her voice was low, stripped of its usual command, rough with something that sounded dangerously like need. I paused, my fingers still lingering on the fabric near her skin, my chest inches from her back. "What about them?" "They're steady," she murmured. "Everyone else shakes before a case like this. You don't." "I'm not the one holding the scalpel," I said softly, leaning in until my mask brushed the air near her ear. "I'm just the one making sure you don't fall." She turned her head slightly, just enough that I could see the profile of her lashes against her cheek. "That," she said, her voice trembling, "is a dangerous promise to make." I finished the knot. I let my hands drop, but I didn't step back. Not immediately. For a heartbeat, we stood there, the only two people in the world, suspended on the edge of a cliff. Then the door swung open. The circulating nurse burst in with the cooler of blood. The spell shattered. Anna stepped forward, her armor reforming instantly, her spine straightening into steel. "Let's go," she said, not looking back. But as we walked into the OR, I saw her hand brush the back of her neck, right where I had touched her, as if she could still feel the burn. The distance between us hadn't just shrunk, it had evaporated. And we both knew it. The rumor mill in a hospital moves faster than a sepsis infection, and it is just as toxic. By the time I walked in for my shift on Tuesday, the story had already mutated 3 times. The core of it, however, was consistent. The board was launching an inquiry. The word being thrown around in the break rooms and the nurses' stations was aggressive. It is a word they love to use against women who hold scalpels with more authority than the men standing next to them. Apparently, Anna had undermined a senior consultant during a bypass procedure. In reality, as I later learned, she had stopped him from suturing a valve incorrectly, effectively saving the patient from a stroke on the table. But the patient's survival was a footnote. The consultant's bruised ego was the headline. I saw the fallout happen in real time near the elevators of the West Wing. It was public, it was humiliating, and it was designed to break her. Mr. Sterling, a hospital administrator whose primary medical qualification was balancing a budget sheet, was standing over her. He was a tall man who used his height as a weapon, invading her personal space, his finger jabbing the air inches from her face. "We cannot have a chief of surgery who operates as a rogue agent, Dr. Gerber," he was saying, his voice loud enough to carry down the corridor. "Your technical skills do not grant you immunity from the code of conduct. You are creating a hostile work environment." I stopped by the nurse's station, gripping a patient file so hard the edges crinkled. I watched Anna. She didn't shrink. She didn't argue. She stood in what I had come to know as her marble state, perfectly still, expressionless, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She was letting his anger wash over her like water over stone, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But I knew her now. I knew the micro-expressions that signaled distress. I saw the way her throat moved as she swallowed, the slight tremor in her left hand that she hid by making a fist. She looked isolated in a way that made my chest ache. When Sterling finally stormed off, adjusting his expensive tie, Anna didn't move for a full 10 seconds. Then, she turned on her heel and walked toward the on-call rooms, her stride sharp and fast. I gave her 20 minutes, then I followed. The on-call room was a small, suffocating space with a bunk bed that nobody ever slept in and a single window overlooking the rain-slicked ambulance bay. The lights were off, the room illuminated only by the orange glow of the street lamps outside. Anna was standing by the window, her silhouette rigid against the glass. She wasn't crying. Crying would have been a release. This was containment. She was vibrating with a suppressed rage so potent, it felt like the air pressure in the room had dropped. I stepped inside. I didn't ask for permission. I turned around and slid the deadbolt across the door. Click. The sound was loud in the silence. It was a deliberate choice. I was sealing us in, creating a container where the chief surgeon didn't have to exist, where the iceberg could melt without drowning the ship. Anna spun around. Her face was a mask of fury. "Get out," she snapped. The voice wasn't the protocol voice. It was the voice she used on incompetent residents. "I did not page you. I do not require assistance. Unlock that door and leave." "No," I said, leaning back against the wood, crossing my arms. "Excuse me?" She took a step toward me, using the full weight of her authority. "I am your chief of surgery. When I give you a direct order, you follow it. You are a technician. You are here to hand me instruments and keep your mouth shut. Do not mistake our coffee breaks for friendship. You are subordinate. Now leave." She was trying to hurt me. I saw it clearly. She was throwing up the walls, reinforcing the hierarchy, using her rank as a shield because she felt exposed. She wanted me to leave so she wouldn't have to be vulnerable in front of me. She wanted to drive me away before I could see her bleed. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I matched her intensity with the stubbornness that Chicago had bred into my bones. "You can yell at me all you want, Anna," I said, my voice steady, dropping the titles. "You can write me up. You can fire me tomorrow morning if it makes you feel powerful again. But right now, I'm not going anywhere because you're shaking and you're alone. And I'm not going to let you stand in the dark and convince yourself that you deserve this." She stopped. The cruel words died in her throat. She stared at me, her chest heaving, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had come, leaving something raw and terrified in its wake. The quiet that followed was heavy, jagged. The anger that had propelled Anna into this room didn't just vanish. It transmuted into a dense fog, stripping away the oxygen. She stared at me, chest heaving, waiting for me to back down. But I didn't move. I stayed leaning against the wood, grounding myself. "You don't have to do this," I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of the earlier defiance. It was just a statement of fact. You don't have to carry the entire hospital on your back and then hate yourself when your knees buckle. You're human, Anna. It's not a diagnostic failure." She flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of the muscles around her eyes. But in the dim orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the window, it looked like a fracture. "You don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. The venom was gone, replaced by a devastating exhaustion. "They're waiting for me to fail. They have been waiting since the day I was hired. Let them wait." I pushed off the door. The movement was slow, deliberate. I wasn't advancing on a superior officer. I was approaching a wounded animal that was liable to bite if I moved too fast. I took a step into her personal space. The exclusion zone she usually maintained was gone. In its place was a magnetic field that pulled me in with terrifying force. "I'm not going to leave," I told her, closing the distance until I was standing toe to toe with her. I could smell the faint, lingering scent of the antimicrobial soap she used, mixed with the salt of her skin. "So you can stop trying to scare me off. It won't work." She looked up at me. Her guard was completely down, her expression raw and open in a way I knew no one else had ever seen. Her facade had crumbled, leaving only a woman standing in the dark, terrified and alone. I reached out. It was the most dangerous thing I had ever done in my career. My thumb traced the line of her jaw, sweeping back a stray lock of blonde hair. The reaction was instantaneous. Anna didn't pull away. She didn't slap my hand down or bark a reprimand. She crumbled. The tension that held her spine rigid, the steel that kept her jaw locked, simply evaporated. Her eyes fluttered shut, her lashes dark against her pale cheeks, and she leaned into my touch. She pressed her face into my palm with a desperation that stopped my heart cold. It was a surrender. It was an admission of a need so profound it bordered on physical pain. "You're warm," she breathed, her voice barely a ghost of sound. "You're freezing," I murmured. I traced the line of her cheekbone with my thumb, marveling at the softness of her skin. It was such a stark contrast to the sharp edges she presented to the world. She let out a shaky exhale, her breath washing over my wrist, warm and erratic. "You are beautiful," I whispered. The words fell out of my mouth before I could check them, honest and unfiltered. "When you stop fighting the world." "God, Anna, you are breathtaking." Her eyes snapped open. Her pupils were dilated, dark pools in the shadows. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and hunger. Then, she moved. Her hand shot out and gripped my wrist, her fingers digging into my skin with shocking strength. It wasn't a push. It was an anchor. She held on to me as if the floor had dissolved and I was the only solid thing left in the universe. Her grip was tight, the nails biting in through the fabric of my scrub top, grounding her, burning me. "This is a mistake," she said. But she didn't let go. She pulled me closer, imperceptibly, until our chests were inches apart. "Probably," I agreed, my voice rough. "But I don't care." The atmosphere in the small room shifted violently. It wasn't just comfort anymore. The air thickened, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. The rules had shattered. We were two women in the dark, standing on the precipice of something we couldn't take back. She looked at my mouth, then back to my eyes. The fear in her gaze was being rapidly consumed by something else, a sharp, undeniable want. She tightened her grip on my wrist, pulling my hand firmer against her face. And for the first time, I realized that the space between us wasn't waiting anymore. It was demanding. The moment shattered before it could fully form. The shrill, demanding beep of a pager cut through the heavy air like a scalpel. Then another. Then mine. Then the overhead speakers crackled to life, a voice devoid of emotion announcing a major incident, A&E, all available surgical staff to trauma immediately. A multi-car pileup on the M4. Black ice and bad luck. The world outside had crashed its way into our sanctuary. Anna didn't hesitate. The vulnerability vanished. She released my wrist, her eyes already shifting from desire to calculation. "Go," she said. And we ran. The emergency room was a cacophony of controlled panic. Gurneys were wheeling in, paramedics shouting vitals, the floor slick with rain and blood. It was a scene that usually induces paralysis in the uninitiated. But Anna Gerber didn't paralyze. She ascended. I watched her wade into the chaos. She was a conductor in a symphony of trauma. She barked orders, not with cruelty, but with an absolute clarity that cut through the noise. Get a central line in Bay 3. I need O negative in Bay 2. You, resident, stop shaking and apply pressure. She was everywhere at once, assessing injuries with a glance, making life or death decisions in the space between heartbeats. She was terrifyingly efficient, a machine of flesh and blood designed to hold back death. There was a moment, amidst the madness, when I looked across the trauma bay. She was intubating a patient, her hands steady, her face splashed with the harsh overhead lights. She looked fierce. She looked untouchable. And in that moment, watching her save a life with the same hands that had just clung to me in the dark, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just attracted to her. I wasn't just curious about the woman behind the ice. I was in love with her. It wasn't the soft, romantic love of poetry. It was a hard, jagged thing, forged in the adrenaline and the blood and the absolute competence she displayed. I loved the way she didn't flinch. I loved the way she carried the weight of survival for strangers. I loved her simply because she was formidable. We operated for 6 hours straight. 2 thoracotomies, a splenectomy, and a complex vascular repair. We moved around each other like satellites, wordless and efficient, anticipating needs before they existed. We worked with a new energy, a shared secret, a tether that kept us connected across the sterile field. When the last suture was thrown, and the sun was beginning to bleed gray light through the windows, the adrenaline finally crashed. The hospital quieted down, returning to its low, rhythmic hum. We didn't go to the break room. We didn't go to the canteen. By silent agreement, we retreated to the locker area in the basement, a narrow corridor lined with gray metal and filled with the smell of damp coats. It was empty. Just the hum of the ventilation and the distant sound of a floor buffer. Anna leaned back against her locker, sliding down until her heels hit the floor. But then she stood up again, restless. Her hands were shaking. The adrenaline dump was hitting hard. She tried to clasp her hands together to hide it, but the vibration traveled up her arms. I didn't speak. I stepped forward. I didn't ask this time. I didn't hesitate. I pulled her into me. It wasn't a tentative hug. It was a collision. I wrapped my arms around her waist and pressed her back against the metal lockers. The sound of her body hitting the steel echoed in the quiet hallway. Thud. She gasped, but she didn't push me away. She melted. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, her shaking hands clutching at the back of my scrub top, gripping the fabric like a lifeline. We stood there, fused together in the dimly lit corridor. I could feel her heart hammering against my chest, a frantic rhythm trying to sync with mine. I could smell the sweat of the last 6 hours, the antiseptic, the exhaustion, and beneath it all, her. It was intimate in a way that felt almost illicit. This wasn't professional comfort. This was possession. "I've got you," I murmured into her hair, tightening my hold until there was no air left between us. "I've got you, Anna." She didn't answer. She just held on tighter, her breath hot against my skin, her body heavy against mine. The shaking slowly subsided, replaced by a heavy, languid heat. We stayed like that for a long time, long enough for the lines to blur completely, long enough for me to realize that I never wanted to let go. The restraint we had built wasn't just cracking anymore. It was crumbling into dust. It was fitting that we ended up in the viewing gallery. It was the highest point in the surgical wing, a dark, glass-walled observation deck that looked down into the silent, empty theaters below. It was 3 a.m. again. the witching hour, the time when the hospital hierarchy usually dissolved into exhaustion. But tonight, the hierarchy was the only thing Anna had left to hold on to, and she was gripping it with white-knuckled desperation. She was pacing the length of the narrow room, her heels clicking against the linoleum in a sharp, agitated staccato. The vulnerability from the locker room had been shoved back into a box, locked tight, and buried under layers of professional armor. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the reflection of the empty theater in the glass, perhaps wishing she was down there, cutting something, fixing something, doing anything other than feeling what was happening between us. "This is unsustainable," she said. Her voice was brittle. "If the board finds out I'm compromising the sterility of my department for a distraction, they will have the ammunition they need to remove me." She turned to face me, face pale in the low light. She was trying to freeze me out, to use the vast distance of her title to push me back to safety. "You need to transfer," she said, the words landing like stones. "I can sign the paperwork. Day shift. Or a different hospital entirely. St. Thomas is hiring. I can make a call." I stood by the railing, watching her build this fortress of logic. It was impressive, really. It was a perfect architectural defense designed to protect the softest thing in the room. But I wasn't a resident she could intimidate, and I wasn't a peer she needed to impress. I was the one person who knew what she looked like when the lights went out. "Are you done?" I asked quietly. "I am serious," she snapped, her voice rising. "You don't understand the optics. You don't understand what it took for me to get this chair. I cannot risk it for..." "For what, Anna?" I cut in, stepping away from the railing. "For a coffee break? For a conversation? Or for the fact that for the first time in 10 years, you're not the scariest person in the room?" She went silent, her mouth slightly open. I took a step toward her, then another. I walked right through the invisible barrier of her authority. "I'm not afraid of you, Anna. I never was. The nurses are terrified because you don't let them see you. The residents are scared because they think you're perfect. But I know you're not. I know you drink your coffee black because you need the bitterness to wake up. I know you hide in the on-call room because the silence is the only place you can breathe. And I know that right now, you're not trying to send me away because you're worried about the board. You're doing it because you're terrified that I might actually stay." I stopped a foot away from her. The air between us was so charged, it felt like ozone before a lightning strike. "I don't care about the title," I whispered, stripping the words down to the bone. "I don't want the chief surgeon. I want the woman who sat in the dark with me and admitted she was lonely." Anna stared at me. The defense shattered. It didn't crack, it disintegrated. The rigid posture collapsed, her shoulders dropping as the breath left her lungs. She looked at me with a devastation that was terrifyingly open. "You are infuriating," she breathed, her voice shaking. "I'm honest. You're dangerous. Only if you let me be." She made a sound in her throat, a desperate, frustrated noise that had nothing to do with medicine. Then she moved. She didn't step, she surged. She crossed the small distance between us with a sudden, overwhelming urgency, her hands reaching out to grab the lapels of my lab coat. She pulled me in, and the collision was absolute. When her mouth found mine, it wasn't tentative. It wasn't a question. It was a reclaiming. It was months of sterilized silence exploding into noise. She kissed me with a hunger that bordered on violence, her lips hot and demanding, tasting of the bitter coffee we shared, and a desperation she had kept leashed for too long. I gasped against her mouth, my hands flying up to tangle in the hair at the nape of her neck, gripping her, holding her there. There was no finesse. It was messy and bold and real. She pressed me back against the glass wall of the viewing gallery, her body heavy and solid against mine, her hands fisting in the fabric of my coat to anchor herself. I felt the vibration of her groan against my lips, a low, guttural sound of relief. It felt like falling. It felt like finally landing. The cold was gone. There was only fire, and it was consuming us both. The morning after a revolution is always quiet. We left the viewing gallery separately, adhering to the professional boundaries that still technically existed. But the air between us had fundamentally shifted. It wasn't just oxygen anymore. It was a shared secret, heavy and sweet. Walking down the corridor toward the locker rooms, I felt a strange, vibrating thrill under my skin. She had kissed me like the world was ending. And now, we had to go back to being Dr. Gerber and the tech, pretending that our gravity hadn't just inverted. Navigating the corridors became a high-stakes game of subtext. A pass chart wasn't just administrative work. It was a conduit for a brush of fingers that lasted a fraction of a second too long, sending a jolt of electricity straight up my arm. An elevator ride with 3 other residents became a theater of tension, where her eyes would meet mine in the reflection of the steel doors, dark and knowing, while she verbally dissected a resident's suture technique. We were speaking a language no one else could hear, a dialect of glances and micro-expressions that made the 12-hour shifts feel like a prelude to the moments we could steal. We established a new protocol. It no longer involved the sterile break room at 3 a.m. It moved to the warmth of my flat on rainy Tuesday nights. It involved cheap wine instead of canteen coffee, and pasta that I cooked while she sat on my counter, out of scrubs, wearing one of my oversized sweaters. Seeing the chief surgeon in soft cotton, barefoot, laughing at my terrible impression of Mr. Sterling was a revelation. It was in these moments, away from the fluorescent glare, that the last of the ice melted. She wasn't the terrifying authority figure here. She was just Anna. She told me about the pressure of her legacy, about the loneliness of the top, and I listened, grounding her with a touch, a kiss, a promise that she didn't have to carry it alone. The hospital felt the change, even if they couldn't name it. She didn't soften entirely. She was still terrifyingly competent, but the temperature rose. She stopped terrifying the interns quite so much. She started saying, "Thank you," more often. Miller, the nervous resident, actually smiled in her presence once, without looking like he was about to pass out. The staff whispered that she must be taking vitamins or practicing yoga. I just smiled behind my mask, knowing the source of that warmth was the secret we kept tucked between shift changes. Then came the email, a notification from Chicago. My old hospital wanted me back. Senior lead, better pay, closer to family. It was the smart move. It was the logical next step in a career that I had put on pause to come to London. I sat with the offer on my phone in the break room, the cursor hovering over reply. Anna walked in. She saw the screen. She didn't ask. She just went still, that old fear flickering behind her gaze, the fear that everyone eventually leaves, that the warmth is temporary. "It's a good offer," she said, her voice tight, reverting to that clipped professional tone. I looked at the phone. Then I looked at her, the woman who had let me see the cracks in the marble, who had trusted me with her vulnerability. "It is," I agreed. Then I deleted the email. "But the coffee there is terrible, and I think I'm finally getting used to the rain." The relief that washed over her face was better than any paycheck. I wasn't staying for the NHS pension. I was staying for the 3 a.m. quiet that wasn't lonely anymore. I was staying for the way she looked at me when no one was watching. We walked out that morning into the London grey. We didn't hold hands. Not yet. Not here. But as we stepped onto the wet pavement, her shoulder brushed mine. It was a solid, deliberate weight. A promise. We were no longer just colleagues surviving the night. We were partners. building a new day. We started with a protocol of silence and ended with a protocol of love. The operating theater is still cold, and the stakes are still life or death. But I don't feel the chill anymore. Not when I know that the hand passing me the scalpel is the same one that holds mine in the dark. If you believe in breaking the rules for the right person, subscribe for more stories. Sometimes, the risk is the only thing that matters.